And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. This episode does not tell a story. It names what survives when stories distort, simplify, or erase. You will not find resolution here, only voices that refuse to perform their pain into something beautiful. It begins with romanticization, the cultural insistence that suffering must be aesthetic, that caregiving must be noble, that trauma must be transformative. But what follows is not critique. It is residue. The testimonies remain unresolved, recursive, and exact. If you came looking for insight, you may need to stay confused long enough to notice what confusion protects. The part of experience that refuses translation. This is not the beginning. It's what remains when beginnings break, what survives despite beauty being demanded. You didn't choose the myth, but it remembers you. Before you knew its name, before anyone called it love or struggle or grit or healing, you were already shaped by it. You were taught to believe that pain could be beautiful, that survival could be a story worth telling, that suffering might even be good for you. The myth never had to prove itself. It just arrived, dressed in narrative, and waited. And because you were hurting, or quiet, or trying to make sense of what no one warned you about, you let it in. What followed wasn't transformation, it was misrecognition. Stalking became devotion, poverty became resilience, neurodivergence became charm. Each wound translated into a metaphor, each collapse repackaged as growth. To question this was to seem bitter. To refuse it was to become invisible. The contradiction was there from the start, that to be heard you had to consent to your own distortion. These weren't exaggerations, they were the cost of visibility. As Foucault warned, to be seen is also to be claimed. The stories that followed weren't told to perform. They were told because silence had become unbearable. A girl sexualized before she understood the word. A woman stabbed after every institution said it wasn't serious. A man paying to couch surf while holding a job. These aren't the voices that fit the arc. They interrupt it, they haunt it, they remain. What Simone Weil called affliction becomes legible here, not as pain, but as displacement from the world. This isn't moral, it isn't poetic, it's what remains when the myth fails. And still, something speaks, not with clarity, not with insight, but with the stubborn presence of what was never resolved. To listen is not to agree or to understand. It is to hold a contradiction without collapsing it into meaning. It is to realize that some things resist performance, not because they are weak, but because they are structurally misaligned with the system that demands coherence. The wound is not the problem, the frame is. Stalking is not persistence. Caregiving is not a calling. Homelessness is not freedom. These myths do not survive because they are true. They survive because they are useful, because they allow others to look at suffering and feel something manageable, pity, inspiration, even entertainment. But those who live through it know the difference. They know what it costs to be watched but not protected, to give care until the self disappears, to sleep in a car while being told they chose this life. These aren't misunderstandings. They are cultural scripts written to preserve distance. Behind every one of these myths is a structural failure, the law that doesn't listen, the system that waits for evidence of harm instead of preventing it, the institution that praises your endurance while counting on your silence. Iris Marion Young called it structured invisibility. And here it lives in the gaps between what's real and what's seen. These aren't isolated events. They're patterned omissions dressed in language that flatters the audience. To name them is not enough. They return anyway, repeating across gender, class, diagnosis, geography. Romanticization doesn't erase suffering, it aestheticizes it. It converts it into a narrative commodity. What makes it dangerous is that it feels like recognition while it performs erasure. And what's left is not catharsis, but residue, a kind of narrative afterlife that clings unresolved. This is where contradiction becomes method. To believe that visibility is safety, that inclusion is justice, that being heard is the same as being held. These contradictions don't need to be fixed, they need to be housed. Agamben's bare life is not theoretical here. It's logistical. It's eating fast food because you can't store groceries. It's paying strangers to sleep on a couch. It's being warned that if you speak, the people you love will be hurt. The myth wants a story. It wants transformation. These voices offer none. What they offer is a presence that refuses to vanish, a clarity that feels like friction, a narrative that breaks itself open to avoid closing. Not because it lacks shape, but because it refuses to imitate the systems that caused the wound in the first place. Caregiving is framed as love, but often it is labor, unpaid, invisible, and consuming. The language surrounding it flatters sacrifice while erasing exhaustion. Words like devotion, patience, resilience, but behind them is a collapsed self, stretched across years of unrelieved responsibility. To care in these stories is not noble, it is survival in the absence of alternatives. No one romanticizes the 3 a.m. moments where identity blurs and the body begins to fail. No one writes about the erosion of solitude, the dissolution of boundaries, the daily theft of time. And still, these roles are handed down, wrapped in the moral vocabulary of love. Silvia Federici named it decades ago. Reproductive labor holds the world up while being erased from view. This isn't metaphor, it's political architecture. It's the economy of depletion, where entire support systems are designed around unpaid, unrelenting presence. The caregiver is not supported. They are assumed. The reward is absence of rest, of self, of recognition. The compensation is silence. Yet the myth persists. The smiling mother, the devoted daughter, the heroic partner. To push back is to seem ungrateful. To break down is to seem unstable. The contradiction is clear. The system that demands care is the same one that punishes those who show what it costs. And the structure is held together by the unspoken. If you stop, someone else suffers. So you continue, not out of love, but out of structural entrapment misnamed devotion. This is not an argument against love, it is an argument against myth. Love is not the same as sacrificial architecture. The myth wants the performance of love without the redistribution of care. It wants images, not infrastructures. It wants the illusion that someone will always step in. And if that someone breaks, the story doesn't change. It finds another image, another name, another body to carry what systems refuse to hold. So the caregiver becomes not a person, but a placeholder. And in the myth, they are always smiling, always coping, always already erased. There is no resolution here, only trace. The trace of time taken, not returned. The trace of a body used as scaffold. The trace of a person remembered only by what they gave up. The myth forgets them, but the fracture remains. Mental illness is not complexity made beautiful. Autism is not quirky pattern recognition. Trauma is not a narrative twist. These lives do not exist to deepen plots. They do not unfold for the sake of revelation. Yet this is how the culture learns to see them, through lenses that soften what is sharp, reframe what is unbearable, and recast what cannot be fixed as something that might still be admired. To speak of these conditions without metaphor is to risk being unreadable. To describe them as they are, relentless, recursive, often isolating, is to violate the expectations of aesthetic coherence. Representation becomes its own kind of erasure, not by omission but by performance. A character has OCD because she's tidy. A boy with autism can recite pi to 10,000 digits. What remains invisible is the masking, the labour, the exhaustion. What remains unnamed is the institutional violence of misunderstanding, losing jobs for being too direct, losing housing for not communicating correctly, losing safety for resisting performance. These are not rare glitches. They are the norm rebranded. Phenomenology breaks here. Husserl's shared intentionality presumes mutual legibility. But what happens when your experience is illegible by design? When clarity cannot protect you? When the act of being understood becomes a risk? These are not exaggerations. They are what it means to be cognitively misaligned with the systems that interpret expression as evidence of intent. To mask is to perform safety. To drop the mask is to invite danger. And still the myth persists. The brave survivor, the misunderstood genius, the one who learns to adapt. These are not stories. They are coping strategies made consumable. They allow others to feel empathy without accountability. They make the pain of others useful. And in that usefulness, the core contradiction appears. Visibility is not justice. Inclusion is not belonging. Recognition is not safety. What returns instead is the phantom, the presence of an identity that cannot be expressed without distortion, a person who cannot enter the story without being altered by it. So they remain half-written, half-held. Too much for the narrative to contain, but too visible to ignore. This is not failure. It is refusal by design, to exist in public without offering coherence, to survive without performance, to name the structures that do not see you and still walk through them, not toward acceptance, but towards something quieter, a space beyond metaphor, a space not yet built. Even homelessness in its rawest form is reshaped by myth, not as deprivation, but as adventure, as escape, as chosen minimalism. These are not merely false stories, they are strategic distortions, ways of preserving the illusion that systems do not fail, that people fall only if they leap. But those who have lived it know better. They know that sleeping in a car is not freedom, that couch surfing is not a game, that invisibility is not peace. They know what it means to trade safety for proximity, and proximity for silence. To be unhoused is not only to lack shelter, it is to lose the grammar of belonging. No address, no identity, no kitchen, no storage, no place to rest without being perceived as a threat. Every movement is a negotiation, every gesture a performance of harmlessness. The myth says this is temporary, that anyone can rise again. But what it refuses to name is the cost of simply staying alive when the structure no longer acknowledges you. As Agamben would say, it is not that rights are revoked, it is that the very frame of recognition dissolves, and then it becomes expensive. A gym membership for showers, fast food for every meal, payment for a couch, hotel rooms when danger escalates. The irony compounds. The less you have, the more everything costs. Poverty becomes a logistical nightmare, not a romantic shedding of materialism. And the people around you, many mean well, some mean harm, most mean nothing at all. They observe, offer judgment or curiosity, and move on. You remain. These stories are not offered for redemption. They are not prelude to success. They resist the arc. They interrupt it. The man in the motel room next to a student debate about whether people like him want to be homeless. The girl seen picking fruit and followed to her mother's house. These are not stories that ask for sympathy. They are fragments that expose the systemic refusal to see, to hear, to intervene. The myth needs the fall to be graceful. It needs the image of the wanderer, not the bruises from sleeping upright. Not the loss of medical care, not the rituals of daily invisibility. These things do not fit the frame, so they're edited out, but the people remain, and they remember. What remains then is not resilience, it is residue. The mark of having lived through something that others romanticize only because they never had to survive it. There is a silence that appears at the edge of language, not from lack of words, but from refusal. These voices arrive there, not to be decoded, but to be held. Not to teach, but to mark what it feels like when the narrative fails to contain the body, the mind, the history, the contradiction. What Judith Butler names as the sedimentation of harm, the slow layering of structures into the self, appears here not as concept, but as rhythm, the repetition of erasure, the recurrence of misrecognition, the weight of being mistaken for something survivable. These testimonies are not stories, they are interruptions, discontinuities, counter-rhythms. They do not move forward, they drift, echo, repeat. Their structure is not arc but field. Their tension is not rising action but recursive presence. They resist resolution, not because they lack it, but because they have seen what resolution costs. Catharsis is not available to those who are still living in the scene. Cathy Caruth once said, "Trauma speaks in a language not fully its own." Here, it does not even try to speak for itself. It fragments, it surfaces, it returns, not in metaphor, but in residue, not as meaning, but as atmosphere. Their existence is not a request for empathy, nor a plea for transformation. It is a record, it is a structure. It is what survives when the myth fails to digest the thing it tried to romanticize. Until next time.
Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.